Whether he's here or not, I'm not entirely sure, but I need to do this very quickly. There he is, he's down there in his bunker. I think he's AFK. Genuinely AFK.
Mumbo Jumbo, you are AFK. I'm gonna take that moustache away. Mumbo, 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 AFK. I'm gonna take that moustache away. Mumbo, 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 mumbo. Mumbo Jumbo, you are AFK. I'm gonna take that moustache away. Mumbo, 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 AFK. I'm gonna take that moustache away. I'm gonna take that moustache away. Mumbo, 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 mumbo.
Oh my goodness! I should not sing when my voice is terrible. All the time, Mumbo's been standing there. Oh my goodness! Oh,
I'm gonna take that moustache away.
oh brilliant.
Mumbo, 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 mumbo.
Tiny, 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 tiny time lapse. 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 Tiny, 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 tiny time. Tiny, 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 tiny time lapse. 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 Time lapse, time lapse, time lapse, time lapse. Tiny, tiny time lapse. That's it. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Beautiful. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Cool. Tiny, 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 tiny time lapse. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Tiny, tiny time lapse. This is gonna take a while. Tiny time lapse. So now I have to do the incredibly dull task of working out where the items are going to go. You know? So you know what that means? It's a tiny, 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 tiny time lapse. 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 Time lapse, time lapse, time lapse, time lapse. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Yes. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Tiny, 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 really good. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Tiny, tiny time lapse. Wait, hang on, what? There's got to be a creative way in which we can work around this. It definitely isn't the fastest method in the world, but let's crack on with third person time lapse. Tiny, 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 tiny 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 time lapse. Time lapse, time lapse, time lapse, time lapse. That's not good. Oh, that is not good. This is ridiculous. I don't even know what to say. I'm also a tiny, tiny, tiny bit embarrassed. I've done enough talking. That definitely sounded like something from a horror film. Let's move on.
Now, there are various techniques for doing this: cactus, string, sand. Please, no one remix that. And then hold down shift click, shift click, shift click.
And we do the same thing once again.
Click. That won't be a particularly good song.
Here we go. My brain has melted.
Sugarcane, illa, sugarcane, sugarcane, illa, sugarcane, sugarcane, illa, sugarcane.
Okay. Cactus, string, sand. Cactus, string, sand. Cactus, string, sand. Cactus, string, sand. Hold down the shift click, shift click, shift click. Shift click. And then hold down shift click, shift click, shift click, shift click. Cactus, string, sand.
That's good. Sugarcane, illa, shift click, shift click. Those and hose. Cactus, illa, sugarcane, illa, sugarcane. Cactus, sugarcane there, sugarcane there. Those and hose. Those and hose. Here it comes, cactus string, shift click, sugarcane nilla, shift click, cactus string, shift click, sugarcane there, sugarcane nilla, sugarcane nilla, sugarcane nilla, sugarcane. Okay, cactus string, sand, cactus string, sand, cactus string, sand, cactus string, sand. Hold down the shift click, shift click, shift click, shift click, and then hold down shift click, shift click, shift click, shift click, sugarcane there, sugarcane there. That's ridiculous. I just love it. Could you just hear that words are kind of coming and fumbling out my mouth? Oh my word. This has been Mumbo, and I'm out.
Two, three, four. Pay the price, play the cards. If you dealin' right, then kid, you're gonna get far. The stakes are high, give it a try. Place your bets and we'll take you for a ride. Lost in the night, in the shimmering light, a palace of lies, greed in your eyes. Deal into the game and you can surely win it big. It's your fate to choose, go ahead and lose your inhibitions. If you wanna play with power, then you're gambling with the king. So bet on the crown, Casino Royale, chase your ambitions. Take a chance and you can win it all. Win it all. High risk and high reward, but it's your final call. You can cash in now or play again. Play again. It really doesn't matter, 'cause you'll owe me in the end. Heed my advice, eyes on the prize, rolling the dice. Better luck next time. Deal into the game and then the world is at your feet. It's your fate to choose, go ahead and lose your inhibitions. If you wanna play with power, then you're gambling with the king. So bet on the crown, Casino Royale, chase your ambitions. Gambling begins. The wheel starts to spin. A house full of sin. But the house always wins. Deal into the game and you can score on anything. It's your fate to choose. Go ahead and lose your inhibitions. If you wanna play with power, then you're gambling with the king. So bet on the crown, Casino Royale, chase your ambitions. Just the more you can win it all. Bet on the crown.
Taunt, 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 taunt.
by Lovejoy.
She's always asking, am I alright? As safe, auspicious, or in my pint. I'll find the answer or a good night. Thank God the time is short. And yes, you always do that one thing when you wrinkle up the nose bridge. I'm trying to figure out what that meant. I took it as a taunt. Remember way back then in school? Oh, did anybody ever say no to you? Oh, did anybody ever say no to you? Whoa, and I don't think I have a clue. Cause well, did anybody ever say no to you? Oh, did anybody ever say no to you? Whoa, you're always trying to leave the table. Phone calls, toilet breaks, unstable. And don't you think that we can all tell? You're insecure, I guess I always do that one thing when I get too drunk and jump in to figure out what makes your brain tick. I'm a listener. Remember way back then in school? Cause well, did anybody ever say no to you? Oh, did anybody ever say no to you? Whoa, well, I don't think I have a clue. Cause well, did anybody ever say no to you? Oh, does anybody ever say no to you? Whoa. Woo. I don't think so. I don't think so. Get the number for the cab call as you're dashing out the front door. Claim to try to dodge the cat call. Thank God the time is short. And yes, you always do that one thing. Cause when you throw and trash me under your drink.